Hello everyone, Jesse here with IGN, and today, as you might be able to guess from the title, we're talking everything Half-Life 2 RTX, and joined with me to do that today is David Driver Gom, co-lead of Half-Life 2 RTX. David, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. And we've also got Niall Usmani, NVIDIA product manager for RTX Remix here as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Niall. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me, Jesse. Feeling good.
Glad to hear it. So, let's get right into it. In layman's terms, what is RTX Remix?
Yeah, sure. So RTX Remix is a modding platform that allows you to mod a large catalog of classic games, and you can remaster them. You can replace every asset with either AI-generated materials, or you can handcraft assets in Blender to, 30 times the polygonal detail, replace the textures from their original resolution to 4K textures. You can add physically accurate materials, and then you can inject path tracing into these classic games. And that combination essentially becomes a vehicle for remaking games, and you can inject DLSS to make it all run super smoothly so that gamers get not only a cutting edge experience, but it performs super well as well.
You mentioned the cutting edge, and I want to contextualize this back to 2004. So Valve's Source engine, famously at the time, along with the Havoc physics engine, introduced people to how real-world physics could apply to a masterfully crafted FPS. I don't think anyone's doubting that. But within this context, the original game obviously wouldn't have had ray tracing, and the engine wouldn't have supported it. So how does RTX Remix even make this happen?
Yeah, it's really funny to look at, how cutting edge Source was when Half-Life 2 came out. They were using an actual offline ray tracer in order to basically bake lighting into textures and doing their best to kind of simulate as much as they could a realistic lighting model within the technical limitations of the time. And then you have RTX Remix, which allows you to kind of fulfill that vision with the technical tools of the modern day. And so what Remix essentially does is when you're playing Half-Life 2 RTX, you're actually playing the original Half-Life 2 underneath. And what's happening is at playback, Remix is replacing the old renderer from Source with a new Vulkan renderer. And that new Vulkan renderer is capable of doing path tracing. It's capable of injecting DLSS. And it's got a model where it can kind of see everything the GPU can see from these classic games. And it can go, oh, you see that chair asset? The modder has created a higher quality chair asset in the folder structure. Let's swap it in real time. And basically at playback, it's essentially reskinning the entire game while the old game is running to look like a AAA modern game based on all the work the modder has done to, create new lights and remake assets and remake materials and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's evident right away how much hard work has been put into this, but what I'd like to know, and David, this is a question for you. Why was Ravenholm chosen as the opening for this demo in particular? And did this specific level produce any unforeseen consequences or challenges that other levels throughout this campaign just didn't have?
A big feature of Ravenholm has always been its very atmospheric lighting. Probably the part of the game that's most like horror. The rest of it kind of, sci-fi action more or less. But Ravenholm, it gets freaky. There's less ammo. You get the gravity gun. So you have to start using the environment to your advantage. It's one of the most dynamic parts of Half-Life 2. It's really where you've got the gravity gun and Valve's like, hey, here's this playground. Here's all these things moving around, right? And so when you put that in path tracing, right, it's like suddenly all these props that are moving around, all the zombies walking around, everything's casting shadows. The really stark lighting that's being used to create an atmospheric mood translates really well into path tracing. There's a lot of glancing angles, which means that the PBR materials can really shine as the light's coming down and casting self-shadowing on some of the materials we've got as well. At the end of the day, it's iconic. It's like most people's favorite part of Half-Life 2. It's like, hey, if we need to win people over about how good we can make this look, why not target their favorite part and make it look gorgeous, right?
Absolutely. I think it was a choice well made. My first experience with Half-Life 2 was on the Xbox 360 with the Orange Box collection, and going from that to the original PC release to now this, and yeah, it's a stark difference. But what I'd like to do now is take a look at this scene here. So within this shack, you've got a mix of light and hard shadows, different reflective materials like the metal on those gas canisters, the metallic rust from those saw blades. How difficult is it to get all of these different lighting methods to behave realistically? Is it as simple as a toggle, or, as I'd imagine, is there a lot more to it than that?
how lighting works in path tracing is different than source because we have realistic light bouncing. Some rooms may come in a little brighter coming right off the bat because the light is now bouncing around where it wasn't originally. But then we work in the Remix toolkit to adjust those lights. So you can either capture the game lights and modify them outright, or you can add new lights via Remix that have different physically based values that weren't possible in the original game. It's very reminiscent of the original game, but leverages the strengths of path tracing. So making sure, again, we've still got that stark lighting, those sharp glancing angles that cast really great shadows through holes in geometry and everything.
So when I first loaded into Half-Life RTX Remix and I approached that zombie on the saw blade, all I could think was, geez, this looks both beautiful and absolutely disgusting at the same time. And actually, this is a prime example. Obviously, you're able to replace assets, lights, materials, and more with RTX Remix. But for a project like this, how do you decide what can be assisted with generative AI tools when it comes to, upscaling and replacing textures versus making something by scratch, presumably like the zombie model?
So on the team, we've decided to steer away from generative AI. So all the work that's currently in the demo, that's all been done by hand by artists. It's always a complicated one, right? I think for our purposes, we found that like a lot of the assets in Half-Life 2, they had a history, right? Like this zombie here, it's been debated for many years about how exactly headcrabs work. How do they turn you into a zombie and that kind of thing, right? And the artist who made this zombie, a guy named Ted, he has been in debates in the community about, do headcrabs destroy the head? Do they directly interface with the nervous system, that kind of thing? And so when we come to remodel these assets, the human touch is required because you need the context of the community discussion, right? Of 20 years of the community theorizing how these things work. Because when we're remaking them at a never before seen fidelity, we want people to feel vindicated in their opinions they've had, in their theories they've had, right? A lot of us have had the same theories about how the headcrabs work, and we like to use the extra texture detail to give some ideas about how horrible it would be to be this unfortunate guy right here, and how much you don't want to have that happen to you, but that's something we've worked very hard on, to connect with the community and connect with the artists who have a very strong opinion on how that thing should be done.
I think when it comes to generative AI, I think that it's a very useful tool for modders. Like there are a lot of mod teams that don't have a ton of artists. They don't have a lot of art power. And so generative AI can be used to kind of quickly adjust many of the textures in the game, and that frees up time for the limited amount of artists on that team to focus on hero assets and really leave an impression with the assets that are going to really be seen by the player and spotlighted for them on their journey, right? In the case of Orbifold Studios, you've got 100 mod artists. So they have so many artists to kind of really see this vision through, and it shows in the work. I mean, every asset is handcrafted and looks beautiful.
Going back to all of those artists, developers, modders, already there's a ton of devs working on remix projects, from Star Wars Republic Commando to Peter Jackson's King Kong, which is a personal favorite of mine, which speaks to the generation of games I grew up playing. But what is the cutoff point for using RTX Remix? Can it be used on more recent titles as an open modern platform? Can I, for instance, transform something like Elden Ring, for example?
So that would be too recent. So how Remix works is, it is one of the first kind of content agnostic modding tools, in the sense that it's got a catalog of hundreds of games that span different engines and span different eras. How it works is Remix has to be able to understand that older game rendered its graphics in order to kind of disassemble it and reassemble it in the capture process, and then process where we're able to kind of live see the game and replace assets live, replace lights live. It needs to understand how the original game is being rendered. Now, we've seen some really interesting things since we launched, right? When we launched, we thought it would only be compatible with DirectX 8 and 9 games. What we found is the community started almost reverse engineering these older games. So then suddenly, games like Deus Ex became compatible that we never thought would be. And then more recently, we released an SDK that allows you to drop kind of the remix runtime portions into any game if you have the code and you have the know-how. Who knows what's next in terms of what will become compatible.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly been surprised with what I've seen, and as someone who has focused on modding and RTX remix coverage in the past for IGN, it's always impressive to see what new projects pop up next from that RTX remix Discord server. But with Half-Life 2 RTX, as I was playing through the demo, this is what I remembered my childhood memories of Half-Life 2 looking like. how do you push a game's visuals to 2025 standards whilst maintaining the original's art direction?
There's a couple of things which help. I mean, number one, we're all big Half-Life fans, right? And we're fans because so long after, the art design really holds up. Like, the work of Viktor Antonov, rest in peace, and all of his artwork that he did really set a really strong artistic vision for the game that persists to this day. And when you have such a strong basis, it's fairly easy to follow. Something else that has made our lives easier as modders is that Valve is kind of just about getting back in the saddle nowadays. We're seeing things like Half-Life Alyx, and that's kind of a very logical extension of like Half-Life Alyx has PBR materials and it has, much better lighting and that kind of thing. And so whilst Remix is still a lot more advanced and we can do a lot more with it than you could do even in Half-Life Alyx, that's a more modern interpretation of the art style. And so we can use that as a strong reference point, again, as fans, to kind of see, well, how would Valve modernize Half-Life if they had to do it again today? And we can take that as a basis as well.
It's interesting you mention that, and I can imagine it's a lot of responsibility to have, especially given it's such a public project for such a beloved game. But in the past, we've seen remakes and remasters take wildly different approaches to how they interpret art direction. For instance, 2020's Demon's Souls remake by Bluepoint Games. On a technical level, nearly flawless, I don't think anyone is doubting that. And like Half-Life 2 RTX, plays identically to the original. But like the updated version of Demon's Souls, there's already been a mixed reception to how realism or a technical facelift affects those deliberate artistic choices made back in 2004 for Half-Life 2. How do you feel, David, about those fans saying that the original atmosphere and what was carefully conveyed and constructed back then has disappeared because of this march towards realism?
I mean, mods are an organic, very evolving thing, right? This is a big mod project that's very complicated, but it's a mod, right? It's born of the same things that all the major mods of the last 20 years have been born of, right? We are fundamentally just fans of Half-Life 2. When you have different tools, you make different decisions, and you make some that are born of necessity, and you make some that are born of art, and we have to try and unpick why they did what they did. Did they do this because it was intentional, or did they do this because there was a limit, right? That was done because that was what the engine at the time allowed. So then when we come and we remake the zombie to a modern fidelity, we use modern technologies in order to achieve an end result that we hope would kind of be in the artist's mind's eye, right, at the time. There are going to be a wide variety of opinions, right? There's going to be a lot of people who feel like something would be done differently, and a lot of that feedback is stuff that we are taking on board and working with organically. And then, to a certain extent, some of it is just, we all love this game, so we all have very different opinions on how it should be treated and how the art should come across. It's moddable, Remix is out there. Half-Life 2 works with it because we're doing it. There is always room for people to put in their own interpretations, and I feel like that is the healthiest way to approach it. Half-Life 2 RTX is an interpretation, right? We're pretty proud of it. We think we're doing a lot of research to get it pretty on point. If people disagree, which is entirely their right to do so, then they have the tools to go and make that alternative interpretation.
Like you said, this version of Half-Life 2 is just one interpretation of Valve's game, and there's probably going to be many more after this. But I want to dig a little deeper into one scene in particular. Father Grigori's shotgun blast and reveal is obviously an iconic moment within this level. And in the RTX remix version, you've got this beautiful cocktail of smoke plumes, volumetric lighting, and these lovely soft shadows. To me, it looks spectacular. However, it ends up being pretty easy to miss that key storytelling moment. I saw one Reddit comment mention, "There is too much smoke everywhere." Do you look at comments like that? And are you still tweaking and perfecting that balance between, "Oh my god, this looks fantastic," and, "Oh, the player should be looking at this moment right here"? How do you balance between these two things?
Well, as before, it's always organic, right? We're always tweaking, we're always looking at things. I mean, with the example of that smoke and stuff like that, we've already been looking into it, because it's one of those things where, like, once you go beyond just base materials and models, it starts to get a bit complicated once you look into things like particles. It's a completely different kettle of fish, and, we have source particle experts on the team, and you can see the results of that with things like our new fires and our new explosions and that kind of thing, in places where we haven't yet been able to author something different, we've been working with the base game materials, and that's kind of how we've ended up where we are with that smoke, right? Again, it's an evolving process, right? Mods are not, a thing that's like one and done and that's it, it's finished, right? That's never been mods, it's never going to be mods. It's always living and breathing. It's always responding to feedback. It's always deciding, does this person have a point, or do I feel that my vision is worth pursuing, and hopefully the results will win out. It is a complicated thing. We know we're doing something that a lot of people feel very strongly about here with remastering Half-Life 2, and key moments like that are things we are actively working on to make sure match up with the original. But this is a demo, right? This is not the full final game. This is not us saying that this is it always and forever, right? The point of this demo is to go, we've done a pretty strong foundation here. We've covered a huge amount of assets. We've covered a huge amount of the environment. We want to see what the people think.
Yeah, I think it goes without saying, with any mod, any game, any update, there'll always be a level of justification wanted by those playing it for the first time, so I really appreciate your answer on this. But moving away from everyone's favorite shotgun blasting priest, I wanted to highlight my favorite moment from this demo, which I think acts as a great technical showcase for what RTX Remix can promise, and that moment happens right here. Originally, beyond sound and turning that corner, you wouldn't have seen the shadows of those zombies approaching. To me, this is a great example of it altering the gameplay and the atmosphere. What I'd like to know is though, was it just a happy coincidence that this enhanced this particular slice of the level, maybe due to where the lighting was originally positioned in the 2004 version? Or was that a careful consideration on your part?
I'd like to say that we made it up, but we really didn't. There are things like this that will just translate very well. Like Ravenholm has such stark lighting with glancing angles and contrast. That's why it was a great place to start, as seeing what could a fully realized environment look like. The zombies shuffling down the stairs and stuff. You think about the original intention by Valve, right? And they didn't have the shadows, but they did have that moment of you turn around the corner and go, oh, the zombies are coming down the stairs at me. And so it's kind of like path tracing is enhancing that original vision. Not here specifically, but there are other places where we've kind of thought about that interaction and gone, I wonder if there's anything we can do to make that interaction more likely to happen elsewhere, right? Not everywhere, because you don't want the magic to go away, but like elsewhere through the game. For example, in Nova Prospect, when the antlions are knocking about as well, and when they're flying around, the shadows that they cast when they're flying through the smoke, right, in, Half-Life 2 RTX, right, and their wings, and they're casting these big, strong shadows in front of spotlights as they go and they mash up a soldier. These are the kinds of things that, we were able to look at how was the original lighting interpreted and what can we do within that. This is one of those places where I think once it worked out the box, we were like, we got to find more ways to do stuff like this.
There's obviously a lot to consider when it comes to recrafting a game like this, for lack of a better term. And what I'd like to know is, for a room like this, for instance, how do you balance between adding more detail, realism, and extra graphical touches, whilst also having to deal with early 2000s level design? Because this room isn't exactly scaled 1-to-1 with reality. It's a big player space. What was this used for originally, So did your team consider adding in extra props and changing levels beyond just their visuals?
There's a lot of rooms that are pretty boxy, and you can tell that they're from 2004. In places, we have taken the very boxy original game geometry, which if you just put a 4K texture on, it doesn't quite do it. And we have turned them into fake models on the source engine side instead, and then used that as an anchor to replace it in Remix with a completely bespoke model. A easier example to point at to, particularly in Nova Prospect, is a lot of these sharp corners on these plaster walls that are very kind of like 2004 old game engine kind of thing. We've just slightly smoothed them out so that they have just a little bit more of like how you would actually expect a wall that had some wear and tear along its corners to look and feel. And we find these little touches, as well as the big things like replacing really primitive geometry, kind of all comes together to make it feel a lot more in its own space. I'm sure there's more that we can do. Ultimately, this is another thing of one of those balancing acts, right? Like, we don't want to alter gameplay. We don't want to alter the core spirit of some of these levels. visuals, and that's when it's like, yeah, this big zombie room, it's pretty big. It's a little bit comically big for what it is, and it's like, well, what was the purpose of this room before Ravenholm went to hell? I mean, I couldn't tell you. We've gone, okay, well, within the boundaries of what we have here, maybe we just interpret by adding some more detail to the bricks so that we get some great shadows there. We smooth out some of the corners of these wooden boards so that, you know, they kind of have a little bit more weird look to them, like you would expect. And then, you know, we hope that you'll play it and you'll go, oh, this room looks a little bit more like something that could exist. Is also still familiar to people who love it from the original game, because the original game is so iconic. Probably there's every room in the game is someone's favorite room, probably, for one reason or another. And we don't want those people to look at it and go, what have you done to my baby? This massive room that couldn't exist. We want them to feel like it's brought back to life.
I've said this already, but I feel like the team and yourself have done that with this demo. But I'd like to end with one final question, which is, can we expect Orbifold Studios to take on Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and 2 at some point in the future?
Hey, Jesse, the future is uncertain and there may be unforeseen consequences and so on. I can say that right now, Half-Life 2 is a hell of a game to remaster for any mod team. I'm trying to think of examples. The only one I can think of is Crowbar Collective and Black Mesa, and you know, that's in a league of its own. At a baseline, Episode 1 and 2 have a lot of assets that are shared with Half-Life 2, right? Once we finish Half-Life 2, those will already be done by like 70% for Episode 1 and like about 50% for Episode 2. You know, we'll have to see when we get there, but there's absolutely nothing stopping a community effort, even if we don't, from just picking up where we left off and wrapping up the work to be done.
For more videos like this, why not watch our entire gameplay video for Half-Life 2 RTX? And for everything else, you're already in the right place with IGN.